It was late December, 1944. The snow along the Ardennes was thick, gray, and heavy with silence. The guns had quieted after days of chaos. A column of German prisoners, mud-streaked, trembling, their faces gaunt from sleeplessness, trudged down a ruined forest road under the watch of exhausted American soldiers. The air reeked of burnt fuel and cordite. The ground was littered with shattered helmets and broken branches. Somewhere in the distance, a Sherman engine still ticked as it cooled. Among the prisoners, eyes darted nervously, expecting retribution. They had heard stories that captured Nazis would be shot, beaten, left to starve. They braced themselves for it. Then something strange happened. An American private, his face smeared with soot, his jacket torn from battle, opened his pack and tossed a can of rations toward the prisoners. Then another soldier did the same. No words, just food passed across the line. The Germans froze in disbelief. For the first time in weeks, silence broke not from anger, but from a stunned human mercy. That moment would echo across the war. By the winter of 1944, Europe was a continent of ruins. The Allies had landed in Normandy 6 months earlier, tearing open Hitler's fortress Europe. France was liberated, Paris was free, and the German army, once unstoppable, was retreating toward its own border. But the war was far from over. In December, Hitler launched one final desperate gamble: the Ardennes offensive, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. More than 400,000 German troops surged through the snow-covered forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, striking at thinly held American lines. It was the largest and bloodiest battle fought by U.S. forces in the Second World War. The shock was devastating. American units were surrounded, cut off, and overwhelmed. Entire platoons were captured. In places like Malmedy, German SS troops executed U.S. prisoners, machine-gunning them in the snow. For many Americans who survived, that massacre seared a permanent mark of rage. They knew now what mercy looked like when it was absent. Yet, as the German offensive faltered and the weather cleared, the tide turned once more. By mid-January 1945, Allied armor pushed east again. The U.S. First and Third Armies began capturing thousands of German soldiers every day, retreating, freezing, starving, many too exhausted to fight. The roads were clogged with columns of prisoners. Old men, teenage recruits, even boys from Hitler Youth divisions. The German army was breaking apart. Entire battalions surrendered without firing a shot. For the U.S. troops tasked with guarding them, emotions were complicated. These were the same enemy uniforms that had killed friends days earlier. Some prisoners still wore SS runes, the symbols of terror. And yet, standing before them, the Americans also saw something else. Human beings stripped of pride, terrified, defeated. Officially, the U.S. Army operated under the Geneva Convention of 1929, which laid down the rules for the humane treatment of prisoners of war. Captured soldiers were to be disarmed, registered, fed, sheltered, and protected from violence or reprisal. But in the chaos of combat, those ideals often clashed with raw emotion. When your friend had just been killed, when your unit had been shelled for days, mercy was not instinctive. Still, discipline mattered. American soldiers had been trained to maintain it, to distinguish between vengeance and justice. Commanders reminded their men that the enemy, once disarmed, ceased to be a target. Eisenhower himself had emphasized it in his field orders. The treatment of prisoners must reflect the conduct of civilized men, not the hatred of battle. This distinction would soon define one of the most unexpected contrasts of the entire war: how American troops, even in the ruins of Europe, chose restraint instead of retaliation. As the Allied front pushed deeper into German territory, entire towns became makeshift POW centers. Factories, barns, and open fields filled with captured soldiers. By spring 1945, the U.S. Army was holding more than 2 million German prisoners, an unprecedented logistical challenge. Feeding them, transporting them, and guarding them required immense coordination and moral clarity. Yet, amid this scale, countless small acts of humanity emerged. Soldiers who had lost comrades at Bastogne still shared cigarettes with captured Germans. Mess sergeants diverted rations meant for their own units to feed prisoners. And though resentment simmered, it rarely turned to cruelty. To understand why, we must look not only at orders or policy, but at the mindset that shaped these men. Soldiers raised in democratic values, many of them farmers, mechanics, or students who saw the enemy not as monsters, but as men misled by a brutal regime. That cultural foundation would shape the encounters that followed. Moments when compassion slipped through the cracks of war, turning enemies into something else, reflections of shared survival. For many German soldiers, surrendering to the Americans felt like stepping into the unknown. From years of Nazi propaganda, they had been taught that the Western Allies were ruthless, that captured soldiers would be executed or starved, that defeat meant dishonor worse than death. Better to die for the fatherland, the posters warned, than fall into the hands of the enemy. But as the Wehrmacht collapsed, reality forced a choice. With the Eastern Front consumed by Soviet vengeance, most German troops desperately tried to surrender westward. They knew what the Red Army's revenge meant. News of atrocities, reprisals, and civilian slaughter had already spread. The Americans, by comparison, represented an uncertain but far more humane fate. Still, fear remained. Many who laid down their rifles in the Ardennes or along the Rhine did so trembling, waiting for the crack of a rifle butt or the flash of a muzzle. They expected cruelty. Instead, they often met indifference, or, astonishingly, kindness. It wasn't universal. There were moments of brutality on every front. Some American soldiers spat at prisoners or refused water to SS men. But systematic abuse was rare, and it was condemned quickly when discovered. Even in the chaos of capture, officers enforced a line between justice and revenge. This was partly discipline, but also pragmatism. Feeding and sheltering POWs properly reduced escape attempts, lowered guard tensions, and maintained morale. It also reflected a moral confidence that the Allied cause was not just to win, but to remain civilized while doing it. Across Europe, the U.S. Army built temporary enclosures, Rheinwiesenlager, or Rhine meadow camps, along the western bank of the Rhine River. They were massive, hastily constructed fields surrounded by barbed wire, holding tens of thousands of German captives at a time. Conditions were harsh: cold nights, little shelter, and ration shortages due to supply collapse. But compared to what many expected, the Americans' restraint still stunned their captives. Captured German officers recorded their surprise in diaries and post-war testimonies. One lieutenant wrote, "I believed I would be shot. Instead, I was given coffee." Another, captured near Aachen, described the moment his guards handed out rations. "We could not understand it. They had every reason to hate us, yet they shared their bread." The humane treatment of prisoners wasn't simply a gesture of charity. It was a projection of the very ideals America had gone to war for. In a conflict defined by ideology, democracy versus dictatorship, how a victor behaved toward a defeated enemy mattered. It wasn't enough to destroy the Reich. The Allies also sought to prove that their civilization was morally superior to the one they fought. This quiet moral power, expressed not in speeches, but in actions, became one of the most enduring contrasts of the Second World War. Where Nazi Germany had built its empire on cruelty and fear, the Americans demonstrated discipline and decency even amid ruin. And though few realized it then, Those small gestures, a cigarette, a can of beans, a calm word, would ripple far beyond the front lines. Many of those same prisoners would later end up in camps across France, Britain, and even the United States itself. They would pick fruit in Georgia orchards, mend fences in Texas, and work in fields beside American farmers. For many, it was their first glimpse of a society untouched by totalitarian fear. But that transformation from terror to trust began here, on the shattered front lines of Western Europe, in the final months of the war, when a starving prisoner and a weary American soldier met as enemies and behaved, briefly, as men. From that fragile beginning would emerge a series of powerful human encounters, the subject of our next section. For the men on both sides, this war had become deeply personal. By late 1944, few soldiers still believed in glory. They believed only in survival. The frozen forests of Belgium and the Rhineland had stripped everyone down to exhaustion and instinct. American infantrymen had seen friends die in ambushes, tanks burn with men still inside, medics collapse under fire. Each new day carried the weight of revenge. And yet, in the quiet after battle, that fury softened. When the shooting stopped and prisoners stood shivering before them, the adrenaline drained away, leaving something older, deeper, and human. Most American soldiers were not professional warriors. They were young men from farms in Iowa, factories in Detroit, or classrooms in Ohio. They'd been raised with moral codes that didn't vanish when the fighting paused. Even amid chaos, they still heard the echoes of home. Mothers who taught compassion, pastors who spoke of mercy, friends who once shared meals rather than bullets. When they handed over food or blankets to prisoners, it wasn't out of weakness. It was instinct, a refusal to become like what they fought. Many veterans would later say that small act of kindness helped them hold on to their own humanity. One American private recalled decades later, "We'd been through hell, but when I saw those kids in gray uniforms, half-starved, shaking, I realized we could end the war right there, in how we treated them." For the Germans, that realization hit like a shockwave. They had been told Americans were brutes, that capture meant death. Instead, they found men who offered them rations and cigarettes. It was not just mercy. It was disbelief turned into respect. That fragile exchange, a moment between enemies, would do more to dismantle propaganda than any loudspeaker or leaflet ever could. The Second World War was more than a clash of armies. It was a test of civilization itself. The Nazis had tried to erase the line between war and atrocity, glorifying cruelty as strength. The Americans, though not perfect, carried a different creed, that victory without morality was hollow. The Geneva Convention had been signed 15 years earlier, but its spirit was older, rooted in centuries of Western military ethics and Christian humanitarian ideals. U.S. field manuals drilled it into soldiers. A prisoner was to be disarmed, searched, and treated humanely. To mistreat a captive was not only illegal, it degraded the uniform itself. For the commanders, this discipline was strategic. But for the men on the ground, it became moral resistance, a way to preserve sanity. Feeding the enemy, showing restraint, or refusing to humiliate a captive became small acts of moral defiance against the dehumanization of total war. There was also an understanding, quiet but real. Cruelty invited cruelty. Word traveled quickly. If Americans were known for mercy, more German troops would surrender instead of fighting to the death. And the fewer men who fought, the fewer who died. It was a cycle of humanity. Rare, fragile, but real amid the industrial machinery of destruction. This moral current didn't erase all hatred or vengeance, but it showed that even inside the most violent conflict in history, civilization could still breathe. There was also a hard, practical truth. Good treatment of prisoners was good warfare. U.S. forces needed intelligence, maps, unit names, positions, morale. Interrogations worked better when prisoners were fed, calm, and cooperative. The American approach, polite questioning, fair treatment, cigarettes, even warmth, often yielded astonishing results. Captured soldiers, relieved to be alive, frequently volunteered information simply because their captors treated them decently. In field reports from late 1944, intelligence officers noted that German soldiers captured by U.S. forces exhibit unusual willingness to talk. This wasn't weakness, it was psychology. A soldier treated as human responded as one. Furthermore, by maintaining strict adherence to the Geneva rules, U.S. units reduced the risk of reprisals against their own men captured by Germany. Mercy became a form of insurance, a way to protect their comrades behind enemy lines. Logistically, discipline also mattered. A guard who saw prisoners as human was less likely to commit rash acts, more likely to maintain order. Rage burned fast. Professionalism lasted. In every sense, restraint was a strength. Tactical, moral, and human. And so, what began as small gestures, a shared meal, a cigarette, a calm word, evolved into a quiet policy of decency that separated the Allied forces from the brutality that had consumed so much of Europe. But there were deeper layers still, psychological and cultural, shaping this phenomenon on both sides. Those will now come into focus. In the final months of the war, fear was the common language on both sides. For German soldiers, it was the fear of annihilation. For Americans, it was the fear of becoming hardened, losing compassion after too much death. The propaganda machine of the Third Reich had spent years constructing an image of the Allied soldier as a ruthless invader, a destroyer of everything German. Leaflets warned troops that capture meant torture, starvation, or execution. For many, that belief was absolute. When reality shattered it, the psychological effect was profound. Prisoners who had braced for cruelty found themselves disarmed not by violence, but by decency. It upended the mental architecture of Nazi indoctrination. In post-war interviews, German POWs repeatedly described that dissonance. Everything we were told collapsed the moment they gave us food, one veteran of the Volksgrenadier Division said. Another recalled, "We expected hatred. Instead, they treated us like men." That was when I began to question everything we had been told. The power of kindness was not sentimental. It was subversive. By treating the defeated as human, the Americans dismantled the very myth of racial superiority the Nazis had built their empire upon. For the captors, this mercy also had a healing function. In a war where moral lines blurred daily, compassion reaffirmed identity. A soldier could look at a prisoner and think, "I'm still me. I haven't become what I fight." That inner reassurance, subtle but vital, allowed many veterans to live with their memories without drowning in them. War destroys bodies. Mercy repairs souls on both sides. No army behaves humanely by chance. Leadership shapes conduct. At every level, from generals to platoon sergeants, the U.S. Army's treatment of prisoners reflected both policy and principle. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, understood the stakes. He had witnessed firsthand the savagery unleashed by totalitarian regimes. For Eisenhower, the moral strength of the Allied armies was as important as their firepower. In 1944, his directives were unambiguous. Prisoners were to be handled in strict accordance with the Geneva Convention. Violations were to be punished swiftly. In his view, victory had to demonstrate the values it claimed to defend. Beneath Eisenhower, corps and division commanders carried the message forward. Training materials reminded troops that how they treated a prisoner reflected upon America itself. War correspondents noted the same tone. Soldiers who swore, laughed, and fought hard, but still followed rules. That discipline wasn't automatic. It came from leadership that modeled restraint. Sergeants stopped rash acts before they escalated. Officers enforced professionalism even in exhaustion. By 1945, this command culture had become ingrained. Not perfect, but remarkably consistent. There were darker episodes, yes, isolated beatings, revenge killings, moments of chaos. But when they happened, the Army often investigated and corrected them. That accountability was what separated a professional force from a mob. Eisenhower's men would end the war as victors, but also as representatives of a civilization that still believed in limits. A moral compass amid the storm. War is not fought only with bullets, but with beliefs about who has enough and who has nothing left. In 1945, American abundance collided head-on with German scarcity. The United States had entered the war with an economy untouched by bombing. Its soldiers were well-fed, well-equipped, and constantly supplied. German troops, by contrast, were starving. Rations dwindled to crusts of bread, ersatz coffee, and watery soup. Even elite divisions were eating horse meat. When U.S. soldiers tossed cans of Spam or chocolate toward captured Germans, it was not merely generosity. It was a glimpse into another world. To the prisoners, those rations symbolized an unimaginable level of wealth and stability. They saw in that food the proof of everything Nazi propaganda had tried to deny, that democracy could be both strong and humane, prosperous and principled. Many POWs later spoke of that contrast as their first crack in the wall of indoctrination. "The Americans fed us better than our own army," wrote one former Luftwaffe pilot. "It was then I began to understand why they would win." Culturally, this abundance shaped confidence. An army that is secure in its strength has no need for cruelty. A soldier who knows his side is winning can afford to show mercy. And so, in countless small encounters, the material power of America intertwined with its moral self-image, forging an identity not just of victory, but of virtue. The Germans' disbelief, that moment when food crossed the line instead of bullets, was not only about hunger. It was about witnessing a new kind of power, strength without hatred. That moment of contrast, human, moral, tactical, psychological, and cultural, was about to converge into a single, unforgettable scene, the turning point where disbelief turned into understanding. It happened in the last bitter winter of the war, January 1945, on the western edge of the Ardennes. The snow was knee-deep and frozen hard as glass. Columns of American soldiers trudged through wrecked villages, passing burned-out panzers and shattered trees. The Battle of the Bulge had ended, but its ghosts still lingered in the smoke. A group from the U.S. 99th Infantry Division, men who had survived weeks of relentless fighting, were ordered to escort a convoy of captured Germans to a temporary collection point. The prisoners were young and old mixed together, frost-bitten, hollow-eyed, their gray uniforms stiff with ice. They limped more than walked. Some carried their wounded. Others clutched empty canteens. A few still wore the insignia of the Waffen-SS, though their arrogance had long since faded. The Americans walked beside them in silence. No one spoke much anymore. The war had burned the talk out of them. They were too tired to hate. At midday, the convoy stopped near a crossroads littered with shell holes and wrecked wagons. The men were told to rest. An American sergeant opened his pack, tore open a can of sea rations, and sat on the frozen ground. He looked at the prisoners huddled under a roadside embankment. Men so gaunt, their cheeks had caved in. He hesitated. Then, quietly, he tossed one of his ration cans across the snow. It clattered near a German corporal's boots. The man flinched, expecting a trick. When none came, he picked it up, stared at the label, U.S. Army beans and pork, and muttered something in disbelief. The other Americans saw it happen. A few chuckled. Then one more soldier tossed a chocolate bar. Another handed out cigarettes. Soon, food and tobacco were being passed back and forth, enemies sharing what little comfort they had. There was no speech, no sermon, just the sound of hands, frost, and breath in the cold air. For a moment, the war seemed to pause, suspended between past hatred and an uncertain peace. A German lieutenant, once proud and cold, raised his hand in a small, uncertain salute. The American sergeant nodded back. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was something close to understanding. Later, when the column resumed its march, several prisoners walked a little straighter, not because they were fed, but because they had been seen. The guards, too, felt something ease inside them. For the first time since Bastogne, they had done something that felt right. That evening, one of the men from the 99th wrote in his journal, "We gave them food today. I don't know why. Maybe because I'm tired of hating. Maybe because they looked like us." This wasn't an isolated incident. Across Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Rhineland, similar scenes unfolded. Captured Germans who expected rage found restraint. Some cried when handed rations. Others tried to return the gesture, offering what little they had left: a coin, a photo, a word of thanks. For the Americans, these exchanges carried no glory. They weren't heroic in the traditional sense. They were quiet, almost invisible moments, but they defined the moral high ground more than any victory parade ever could. By now, Allied command was capturing prisoners faster than it could process them. The war machine, vast and impersonal, kept grinding eastward. But on the small scale, in forests, barns, and frozen fields, humanity still flickered. The Germans couldn't understand it. To them, war was total. Mercy had no place in it. Yet here were their enemies, men with every reason for vengeance, choosing compassion instead. That contradiction stayed with them long after the guns fell silent. In the weeks that followed, stories of these acts spread quietly among captured units, passed from one camp to another, whispered in disbelief. "They gave us food," one prisoner told another. "They didn't even curse us." It became a rumor of a different kind of strength, the kind that didn't need cruelty to prove itself. That moment on the roadside, one among thousands, marked the beginning of something far larger, the moral victory that outlived the war itself. In the months that followed the Ardennes campaign, the surrender of German forces accelerated on an unimaginable scale. By March 1945, Allied units were capturing entire divisions in a single day. From the Ruhr to the Rhine, streams of disarmed soldiers filled open fields, their weapons piled like broken relics of a dying empire. The Americans faced an overwhelming task: how to feed, guard, and transport millions of prisoners while still advancing toward Berlin. It was a logistical nightmare, but also a moral test. And, remarkably, the same restraint shown on the front lines continued to define how these prisoners were treated behind the wire. Thousands of makeshift enclosures appeared almost overnight across Western Europe. In Germany alone, the U.S. Army created more than 80 temporary enclosures, massive outdoor compounds surrounded by barbed wire and patrolled by tired, mud-covered guards. They were not luxurious, and many suffered from shortages, exposure, and chaos. But the American approach was consistent: discipline first, decency always. Captured German officers noted it immediately. They were fed standard rations, reduced in the first weeks due to supply issues, but never withheld as punishment. Medical units treated the wounded regardless of uniform. Field chaplains offered prayer services for both sides. Red Cross officials, when allowed access, documented a pattern of relative fairness unmatched elsewhere in the collapsing Reich. There were still hardships. The war's end brought hunger and confusion to everyone. Yet the tone remained. No revenge, no mass reprisals. The Americans saw the prisoners not as political enemies, but as defeated soldiers. That distinction mattered enormously. Soon, entire shipments of POWs were transferred across the Atlantic to the United States itself. By the summer of 1945, over 370,000 German prisoners were held in camps across America, from Texas and Louisiana to Minnesota, Georgia, and the Carolinas. For many, it was their first glimpse of civilian life in a free society. These camps were surrounded by fences, but not by fear. The prisoners worked on farms, helped harvest crops, and even joined community choirs or soccer matches. They were paid small wages in canteen coupons, could write letters home, and received medical care equivalent to that of U.S. troops. The transformation was stunning. Men who had once marched under the swastika now sang Christmas carols with American families or learned English from local teachers. Some wrote home saying they were being treated like human beings, not enemies. In post-war testimonies, countless former POWs remembered that shock vividly. "Everything we were told was a lie," wrote one. "We found dignity among our captors." Another recalled a farmer's wife in Kansas who left bread and jam by the fence for them each morning. He said it changed his entire view of America. Meanwhile, the psychological war was already won. When Allied forces liberated concentration camps and revealed the horrors of Nazi rule, many German prisoners compared that darkness to how they themselves had been treated. And the contrast was unbearable. It shattered any lingering belief in Nazi ideology. For some, that moral comparison became the beginning of atonement. Within months, those same prisoners began assisting Allied authorities in rebuilding Germany. Engineers, doctors, and laborers who had once fought the Americans now worked under their supervision. Not out of fear, but respect. By the time the last POWs were repatriated in 1946–47, many carried home more than memories of defeat. They carried proof that mercy could exist even in war. And that revelation, that compassion had been shown when cruelty was expected, reshaped how an entire generation viewed their former enemies. One German veteran summarized it years later. "We came to America as soldiers of Hitler. We left as friends of democracy." What began as a simple gesture, a can of beans in the snow, had turned into something historic. It wasn't a grand strategy or propaganda success. It was moral leadership, expressed through individual decency, multiplied 1,000,000 times over. From the fields of Belgium to the farms of Texas, this quiet ethic of restraint became a living contrast to the brutality that had defined the Nazi era. It would help lay the foundation for something new, a peace built not on vengeance, but on respect. And in that transition, from war to humanity, the true victory of the Western Allies was sealed. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, millions of men found themselves suspended between two worlds. No longer soldiers, not yet civilians. For the German prisoners held by the United States and its allies, this was the beginning of a slow, uncertain return to humanity. In the first chaotic months after Germany's surrender, Allied command reclassified its vast prisoner network. The U.S. Army shifted from combat operations to administration and repatriation, guided by the Geneva Convention of 1929. Every camp, from the sprawling enclosures in France to the orderly compounds in Georgia, became a test of post-war ethics. American officers received orders to maintain rations and treatment, consistent with international standards. It was not always easy. The global supply chain was stretched thin. Europe was in ruins, and feeding tens of millions of displaced people was an impossible demand. Yet, the directive held firm. No retribution, no humiliation. Even as the U.S. military dismantled the Nazi war machine, it avoided treating individual soldiers as extensions of that ideology. They were now laborers, teachers, and witnesses, part of the massive effort to rebuild what the Reich had destroyed. In America, POW camps evolved into small working communities. Prisoners planted crops, repaired roads, and cut timber. Many worked alongside American farmers whose sons were still overseas. At first, mistrust hung heavy over the fields. But over time, the rhythm of shared labor dissolved the distance. Local families discovered that the enemy was often just a young man from Hamburg or Munich who missed his home. Prisoners, in turn, saw a different side of America, one that had no need for slogans or flags to prove its strength. Across hundreds of towns, stories emerged. A farmer's wife in Iowa sewing buttons for POW shirts. A church choir in Mississippi inviting German singers to join. Children playing soccer across the barbed wire. These moments never appeared in war reports. Yet they were the seeds of something deeply human, quietly revolutionary. When Red Cross inspectors toured the camps, they recorded consistent adherence to humane standards, even generosity. Some prisoners received better food than war-torn Germans back home. Others were allowed to send earnings or letters to their families, describing American life in words that defied Nazi propaganda. Still, not all experiences were equal. In the temporary enclosures across the Rhine and near Remagen, overcrowding and supply breakdowns caused hardship and death. But even there, once the chaos of combat ended, U.S. field officers scrambled to improve sanitation and food distribution. Mistakes were corrected, conditions stabilized, and by the winter of 1945-46, the system had normalized. Then, the repatriation began. By 1946, shiploads of German POWs began their long voyage home. Many through New York Harbor, others through the French ports they had once invaded. For most, it was a surreal reversal of fate. The enemy carried home under the flag of his conqueror, but not as a beaten dog, as a man who had been shown mercy. Letters from returning soldiers flooded post-war Germany. They told of fair treatment, clean camps, and the surprising kindness of their captors. These letters circulated widely, softening German public sentiment toward the United States and planting the first roots of post-war reconciliation. Historians later noted that no other occupying power, not even Britain, had produced so many POWs who voluntarily expressed admiration for their captors. That subtle goodwill would prove crucial in the coming years, as the Cold War dawned and Germany was divided. The Americans, without intending to, had won something more enduring than the war itself. They had earned the moral allegiance of those who once followed Hitler. And as the trains rolled east, filled with men returning to ruins, a quiet realization spread among them. They had survived defeat and discovered dignity through their enemies. That would become the silent legacy of America's victory. The first trains carrying German prisoners rolled into a homeland they barely recognized. By late 1946, cities like Cologne, Hamburg, and Dresden were still smoldering ruins. Bridges had collapsed into rivers. Streets were filled with rubble, and families searched endlessly for missing sons. Germany was a country in physical and moral collapse. Those returning from American captivity arrived cleaner, healthier, and strangely hopeful. They spoke of fair treatment, of learning English, of working with dignity. Their stories contrasted sharply with the misery faced by soldiers returning from Soviet camps, where starvation, disease, and execution awaited countless men. In the American and British zones, local civilians listened in disbelief. They had been told by Nazi propaganda that the Americans were brutal, that capture meant torture or death. Instead, these returning POWs described baseball games, library classes, church services, and steady meals. Their testimonies carried immense influence. In a nation stripped of pride, these voices helped introduce a new kind of respect for the former enemy. They had seen a system based not on ideology, but on law, and that distinction became the seed of change. For many, captivity in America had been their first encounter with democracy in action. They had seen black and white soldiers eating from the same mess tents, farmers and prisoners trading work and smiles, guards who enforced rules but never hate. It was a different moral universe than the one they had been raised in under Hitler's totalitarian state, and they brought that vision home with them. Former prisoners began to rebuild with a new mindset, one that valued structure, fairness, and cooperation over blind obedience. Some became teachers and engineers, others, local officials or community leaders. Many later admitted that their time in U.S. camps had reshaped their beliefs more profoundly than any propaganda leaflet ever could. The U.S. War Department, aware of this soft power, quietly encouraged educational programs inside the camps before repatriation. They called it re-education, though it was often just exposure to American civics, newspapers, and open discussion. It wasn't indoctrination. It was demonstration. The prisoners saw democracy functioning, even in captivity. In 1947, as the last major groups of German POWs were sent home, U.S. intelligence noted an unexpected phenomenon. An overwhelming majority expressed gratitude rather than resentment. They carried home not just memories, but habits, punctuality, work ethic, a sense of fairness learned from their captors. That subtle cultural transfer became one of the hidden engines of West Germany's post-war recovery. Historians later linked it to the astonishing speed with which the Federal Republic adopted democratic values and economic stability. While Soviet captivity bred bitterness and despair, American captivity bred imitation and respect. By the 1950s, some former POWs even returned voluntarily to the United States as immigrants, engineers, or university professors. They brought with them a deep understanding of how their enemy had defeated them, not just with weapons, but with principles. In towns like Fort Robinson, Nebraska, or Camp Swift, Texas, local archives still hold photographs. German prisoners smiling beside American guards, hands resting on shovels after a day's work. Faces thin but calm. No barbed wire in sight, just open fields and tired men who had chosen civility over hatred. It's easy to dismiss such moments as small, but collectively, they formed one of the most profound human legacies of World War II. 2. The transformation of enemies through mercy. The war had ended in Europe with cities in ruins, millions dead, and entire ideologies discredited. But in those quiet POW camps, a different kind of victory had already begun. One built not on domination, but on the rediscovery of shared humanity. The Germans who had once expected revenge instead found something that endured longer than any empire: the strength of decency in the face of destruction. And as the world entered the uneasy calm of the Cold War, that moral example, mercy amid chaos, would become one of America's most powerful, if unspoken, triumphs. War is remembered for its violence, for the sound of artillery, the fall of cities, the flags raised in victory. But sometimes its truest legacy lies in the silence that follows. In that moment on the frozen Ardennes road, when a hungry German soldier caught a can of American rations instead of a bullet, something far greater than military strategy took shape. It was a glimpse of civilization surviving inside barbarity, a small act of mercy that would ripple through the aftermath of the most destructive war in human history. For the Americans, it was never about perfection. Their own soldiers were weary, angry, and scarred. But restraint, the choice not to answer hate with hate, became the moral dividing line between democracy and tyranny. And in the eyes of the captured Germans, that choice shattered the last illusions of Nazi propaganda. Historians often define victory in terms of territory or treaties. Yet the moral victory, the decision to uphold humanity when vengeance was possible, became one of the quiet foundations of post-war peace. It turned prisoners into witnesses, witnesses into rebuilders, and enemies into citizens of a more decent world. When those men returned to Germany, they carried more than memories of defeat. They carried living proof that compassion could coexist with strength. And in that proof, the seeds of reconciliation took root. The kind that rebuilt a democracy from the ruins of dictatorship. Every empire that collapses leaves behind questions about what endures. For those who lived through the Second World War, the answer wasn't just written in ruins or treaties. It was written in moments of grace between enemies. Because in the end, the greatest act of power is not to destroy, but to show mercy when the world expects revenge. And that, perhaps more than any weapon or battle, is why history still remembers. The day German POWs couldn't believe it, when the Americans shared their rations instead of revenge.